The First German Republic had a rough start. Their government was formed in the aftermath of World War I, when hunger gripped the nation, their allies had collapsed, the war had become unwinnable, and a revolution had forced the Kaiser to flee the nation. And so immediately, the Republic was hit with a lot of criticism, especially from the right. First, a large part of the nation, especially the elites and the middle classes, despised the parliamentary republic that was created, and nostalgia for the imperial era remained strong. Second, the military created a stab in the back narrative, pinning the blame of defeat on the revolution, alleging that the socialists and the other backers of the republic had betrayed the military, caused their defeat, and were therefore responsible for the Treaty of Versailles, while in reality, Germany was simply exhausted and left without a shot of winning. As a result, from the very beginning, German political lines could roughly be split along two lines: pro-republican, supporting the new system, and anti-republican, seeking either the return of the monarchy, a military dictatorship, totalitarianism, or other alternate government forms. This was not a united coalition in any sense, except that they were all opposed to the new republic. On the Republican side, the main parties were the Social Democratic SPD and the Catholic centrist party Centre. They were often joined by the liberal nationalist DVP, which found itself in the middle of the spectrum. Their leader, Stresemann, kept the party towards the Republican side, but much of the party's middle-class base leaned towards the anti-Republican camp. Then, amongst the anti-Republican parties, the most notable was initially the DNVP, which was the party most directly representing melancholy for the lost Kaiserreich. They quite openly called for the destruction of the Republic and the restoration of the Kaiser. Other parties included the KVP, the Communists, which sought to overthrow the capitalist republic to create a communist state. Around the start of the 1930s, the NSDAP then became the primary right-wing party, which you will recognize as the party of Hitler. On the whole, interwar German politics can be divided in three phases. Upon its creation, it was a parliamentary democracy, where coalitions were necessary to govern. Around 1930, it transformed into a presidential democracy, wherein the president began ruling by decree, fully ignoring parliament. By 1934, this morphed into ultra-nationalist totalitarianism and the full destruction of democracy. The failure of German democracy is mostly associated with these final two phases, but it should be noted that even the parliamentary phase was hardly stable. The average coalition lasted less than 9 months. The reasons for this are numerous. Because of the anti-republican parties, there were often limited available options for coalitions, and between the pro-republican parties, there were major differences between the Catholic Centre, the liberal nationalist DVP, and the social democratic SPD. It also didn't help that they inherited a very tough position, requiring decisive decisions. The economy was in a freefall, communists were attempting revolutions, the military was attempting coups, the French were occupying the industrial areas of Germany, etc., etc. Time and time again, the Republican parties formed a coalition only to see it fall apart over some crisis or dispute. Another problem was that the SPD was the largest party across the entire parliamentary period, but anti-socialist sentiment in Germany was quite intense, and the center and center-right parties were reluctant to work with the Social Democrats. This made the difficult act of forming coalitions yet more difficult, as often SPD votes were necessary to reach a stable majority, but they were kept out of coalitions anyways. But around the end of the 1920s, there seemed hope. The SPD led a grand coalition, which became the longest-lasting parliamentary cabinet. Foreign Minister Stresemann had worked tirelessly to restore Germany's position on the world stage, securing American loans for economic recovery while reducing war reparations, as the economy was strengthening. Germany's industry seemed on track to once more become the dominant European economy. But the Great Depression hit Germany hard. Suddenly, American loans dried up, unemployment rose, and the coalition would once more fall over disagreements about how to handle the rising cost of unemployment benefits. This is when Hindenburg, the president of Germany, became the center of politics. The former leader of the German war effort, he had won the 1925 presidential election. Within the German constitution, the president had a lot of power. He appointed the chancellors and had the power to approve or dismiss members of their cabinet. He could dissolve parliament, lead the armed forces, and had official control over foreign affairs. Most importantly though, was Article 48. Through this, the president could claim sweeping authority in case of crisis. With approval from the chancellor he himself appoints, the president could suspend civil rights and rule by decree, ignoring parliament fully. This was essentially the end of the parliamentary era, giving the president immense political power. Now, for the most part, the Republican parties actually allowed this soft coup to happen. Why? Because they felt that they had no other choice. In 1928, the major pro-republic parties still held a majority, which they lost in the 1930 election. Forming a stable, pro-republican coalition simply seemed impossible. While Parliament had the power to repeal emergency decrees, the president could respond by dissolving Parliament and holding new elections. These elections, in this period of crisis, greatly favored the anti-republican parties, which came to hold the majority in 1932. Parliamentary rule became physically impossible, and out of fear of either the communists or the ultranationalists gaining yet more power, the pro-republican parties supported presidential rule instead. Then in 1932, Hindenburg ran for a second term against Hitler, winning with quite a comfortable margin. Interestingly though, in 1925, Hindenburg had enjoyed the support of the right-wing, anti-republican vote. In 1932, these voters had largely abandoned him, and he even got the endorsements of the Social Democrats. The reason for this was simple. After his victory in 1925, the right had expected Hindenburg to destroy democracy from within and perhaps even restore the Kaiserreich. Instead, he argued that the Republic was necessary to restore Germany's position on the world stage. He approved a pro-détente foreign policy, and he even recognized the new West German border with France and Belgium. As such, many on the right refused to support Hindenburg again in 1932. But following his re-election, Hindenburg decided he wanted to win these voters back, and declared he would force German politics to the right. The moderate Brüning cabinet was removed, and instead, a power struggle began to take shape on the right in order to gain favor with not just the president, but also with Hitler, who by now commanded the largest party in parliament. Von Papen first became chancellor, to then be removed by von Schleicher. Not to be outdone, Papen then struck a deal with Hitler, making Hitler chancellor and giving him new elections, in which his party, in coalition with the DNVP, now reached the majority in parliament. In the years that followed, the ultranationalists stepped up attacks on political opponents, and Hindenburg refused appeals to rein them in, declaring the Social Democrats as traitors. Socialists and communists were refused access to parliament, allowing Hitler to pass the Enabling Act with a 2/3 majority. Through this, the cabinet could legislate without needing parliament nor the president. By this point, Hindenburg remained the only obstacle to full ultranationalist rule, as he could theoretically fire Hitler at any point, and the military would undoubtedly side with the president. Yet, he was quite agreeable to their agenda, and upon his death, the powers of the presidency were merged with those of the chancellor. The ultranationalist takeover of power was now complete. It is not a big leap to say that no person had a greater effect on German interwar politics as Hindenburg. Thus, the 1925 election may well be a crucial turning point in history. Had Marx, the centrist, pro-Republican candidate won, would German politics be in better shape? Could ultranationalism be halted? Since he only lost by a margin of 3%, his victory hardly seems unlikely. Having been supported by most of the pro-Republican parties, he was considered a favorite to win by some. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. There are two electorates often pointed to for a Marx victory. First, the communists actually ran their own candidate too, capturing about 6% of the vote, technically more than enough to swing the election for Marx had the communists dropped out. Except, this relies on the assumption that between Hindenburg and Marx, the communists would vote for Marx. These were anti-capitalists seeking to overthrow this new republic. If they couldn't vote for their anti-establishment candidate, it is far more likely that they stay home than break to vote for Marx. Now the second option is more promising, the Bavarian People's Party. They were a staunchly Catholic, conservative party in Bavaria. Yet, they endorsed the Prussian Protestant Hindenburg rather than the Rhenish Catholic Marx. This was primarily due to anti-socialism, as they protested the endorsement Marx had gotten from the Social Democrats. The BVP had about 870,000 voters in the first round. About 60% of those went to Hindenburg in the second round, which would be enough to barely flip the election in favor of Marx. Now actually getting the BVP to endorse Marx over Hindenburg is a bit difficult, as they feared that the socialists would centralize power in Berlin and reduce Bavarian autonomy. But it doesn't seem all too implausible that Marx may have convinced them to vote against Hindenburg's Protestant Prussian image. Alternatively, if these voting shenanigans are too difficult, we could also simply have Hindenburg refuse to run. In the first round of voting, neither Marx nor Hindenburg finished in the top two. Marx was only third with less than 15%, and Hindenburg had not even ran. Instead, the DVP and SPD candidates finished first and second. But the Social Democrats realized that the center would never break for them in a round 2, so their candidate dropped out. The DVP's Karl Jars feared his odds against an SPD-endorsed Marx, so the right appealed to Hindenburg to run instead. He actually hesitated, as he disliked electoral politics, allegedly consulting with the former Kaiser before agreeing. But had Hindenburg refused to participate, the second round would be totally changed. Braun would still likely drop out, as he'd realized he had no chance, leaving a race between Marx and the DVP's Karl Jars. Now Jars lacks the war hero status of Hindenburg and was generally seen as a relatively boring lawyer. In a race between Marx and Jars, Marx is the favorite to win. So, whichever of these routes we choose, Marx has become the second president of the German Republic instead of Hindenburg. How will German politics evolve as a result? Well, arguably, the immediate changes are not as radical as you might imagine. As mentioned before, the right-wing Hindenburg already let his own base down by being surprisingly reasonable as a president. While Marx may be more open to including, if not letting the Social Democrats lead coalitions, that doesn't solve the fundamental issues of ideological disagreements and the large and growing anti-Republican vote, making stable coalitions difficult. Undoubtedly, the specifics of coalitions in the parliamentary era will have changed, but there is little reason to believe that Germany's coalition culture would be more healthy just from this one victory. That is further compounded by the fact that the right-wing anti-Republican base will be enraged. Whichever alternate election we chose, the right will have lost a close-fought election, and that will sting. Especially for the most ideological and aggressive supporters, defeat in this election may have yet further entrenched anti-Republican beliefs. President Hindenburg, by virtue of being a war hero, mostly kept the loyalty of the military even after disappointing those who believed he would destroy the Republic. But it is far from guaranteed that Marx would enjoy the same kind of support, and it is very well possible some could start plotting more aggressive means of toppling democracy, and we may have seen the middle classes move to the right earlier than they did historically. Towards the latter half of the 1920s, much like historically, Germany will be on the upswing. But then, the Great Depression happens. No matter how much we argue the coalitions of the parliamentary era could be better, there is no way to stop this reckoning. Germany can do everything right politically and economically, but the drying up of American loans and the collapse of the global economy will still hit Germany in the same way. And in finding a solution to the crisis, the limits of parliamentarism would still be tested. The difference between the center and center-right seeking austerity as a response to the crisis, and the Social Democrats preferring government-led programs is large, with the center greatly fearing inciting new hyperinflation. As a result, the government failed to act, and the German economy was the hardest hit out of all the major European economies. During this period, in whichever way we slice it, coalition politics will become nigh impossible, let alone coalitions with actual, decisive plans to combat the crisis. Unemployment in Germany soared to 30%, and the right-wing anti-Republican parties devoured the middle-class parties, causing anti-Republican parties to reach the majority in parliament after 1932. The main question now becomes, how does Marx handle this crisis, and how does it differ from Hindenburg? Here, while it is possible that Marx supports some emergency decrees, it is highly unlikely he ferments a presidential coup in the same way that Hindenburg had. On the upside, this prevents the erosion of democratic parliamentary power in Germany. On the downside, this likely means the near complete political gridlock paralyzing German politics after 1930. It is possible the historical election of 1930 is avoided. It was a snap election, called because Hindenburg had passed an emergency decree. If so, however, that would mean that 1932 would be the most important year for interwar German history. There would be simultaneous elections for the Reichstag and the presidency in this year. Upset with political gridlock and the Great Depression, anti-Republican parties did fantastic in parliament, but Hindenburg did relatively comfortably win re-election. In this alternate timeline, we might either see Marx run for re-election, or another centrist may take his place, facing off against either Hitler or another right-wing candidate. There is no real way around it. This would be the deciding year for Germany. The pressure on the nation would be immense, and it really could go either way. There is no guarantee that the pro-Republican candidate would win, and either of the anti-Republicans winning would mean that German democracy may be at an end anyways, especially since the president commanded the armed forces and the military was generally aligned to the right. But even if one of the centrist candidates won, that would not mean an end to the troubles for the Republic either. For one, It would not solve the political gridlock in parliament, but for another, an aggressive right wing, supported by the military, may well attempt to overthrow the government after such a defeat. Now, if the right-wing candidate does win the 1932 election, this would offer a new path towards the destruction of German democracy than the one we saw historically. Yet still, in the context of a Great Depression-era Germany, with at best a gridlocked parliament and at worst an ultra-nationalist majority, while the military is under the command of the president and paramilitary organizations are given free rein, there is little doubt in my mind that whoever the president is, he would manage to impose his version of dictatorship upon the nation. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean nothing has changed. For one, it really matters which faction represents the right in this election. A Hitler victory will, for the most part, lead to a relatively similar Germany to historically, with changes mostly relegated to butterflies. Yet, a victory from the more traditional right, focused on the military and the lost Kaiserreich, may lead to an entirely different sort of ultra-nationalist Germany, which may even lead to the restoration of the Kaiser. Such a Germany would still be militarist, would still be aggressive, but as we will discuss later, is far from guaranteed to conduct diplomacy and warfare in the same way as historical Germany. To a significant degree, these conclusions would remain the same if we assume the centrist candidate wins, but the military then decides to launch a coup. If the president loses the loyalty of the military at this stage, German democracy is likewise doomed. The main way in which the Republic, historically, combated coups was by calling for nationwide strikes. With 30% of the population unemployed, not only does this tactic lose its viability, a large section of the population may quite simply support the military's actions. Now, for the most part, it's difficult to go in detail about either the militarist dictatorship or the restored Kaiserreich. Their foreign and domestic policies will be so different to historically that in nearly every way we will not be able to compare these nationalist Germanys to the ultra-nationalist regime we saw historically. There is an attempt to be made that the Western powers may treat a military dictatorship that came to power via coup more negatively than one which came to power via the presidential election, but it is still an open question as to how much that would actually matter. But what we do know is that while the generals were nationalists and believed in the greatness of Germany, many did not agree with the foreign policy of the ultra-nationalists historically. They were far more pessimistic about German chances in a war with the West, and were generally stunned when the West just kept giving in to German demands. A militarist Germany's foreign policy may be far more cautious. They would still try to stand up to the West, but may be more risk-averse when it came to actually fighting them. The traditional right also had far less interest in Austria and by extension the Sudetenland. While those lands were inhabited by Germans, they were traditionally part of the Austrian Empire and were Catholic as opposed to the Protestant Prussian-dominated military. Rather, the general focus was regaining the lands lost in World War I, and there was one target more important than any other: Poland. Not only did Poland now control traditional Prussian territories, there was also just a large degree of anti-Polish sentiment within Germany in general. I would very much expect that a military-led Germany, rather than going after Austria, would put their diplomatic leverage in fomenting a war with just Poland. In the least case, focusing on regaining Danzig or the broader Polish Strip, and in the furthest case, trying to regain all former imperial territory, if not, the complete destruction of Poland. Of course, German success here depends both on French and British pushback and how averse to war the Germans are. There is also the question of whether the regime would be willing to work with the Soviets to overturn Versailles, or refused to on ideological grounds. All in all, such a military-ran Germany would still be a large cause of European geopolitical chaos. And there are still plenty of avenues for European conflict or reorganizations. And while World War II may very well be avoided, it could be replaced with other, smaller conflicts, wherein entire nations may still disappear from the map. Now going back, it is still very possible that Marx or another centrist does win re-election. Should the military then remain timid or fail in their coup attempt, then German politics may turn out yet more differently. The 1930s will still, without a doubt, be a very troubling time for Germany. The economic crisis would persist for years. Right-wing paramilitaries will march on the street. Communists will be threatening revolution, and electoral politics remain paralyzed, with no viable coalitions being possible. Such a Germany is not a major player in the 1930s, as they mainly just wait for things to get better, being in a pseudo-state of civil war. Yet, in terms of European stability, this is way more preferable than what we got historically. Such a Germany will not be in a position to expand or to threaten war. In fact, it may even seek to further European cooperation and integration in an attempt to jumpstart their economy again. This would have massive ripple effects across Europe. Arguably, Germany was the only power strong enough to start a world war. The Italians were too weak, and the Soviets were too careful, very aware that any military action could spark a continent-wide response. There would still be tension points. Italy will likely still invade Ethiopia, and there would likely still be a Spanish Civil War, now being fought mainly between Italians and Soviets. Italy in general would attempt to position themselves at the center of a southern European-focused alliance bloc, yet would struggle to maneuver as they had to keep the Western democracies on side. The Soviets know that they can't start military invasions, and an actual revolution succeeding in Germany is just not happening. While a war in Asia is still likely, without the massive diversion of Germany in Europe, Japan may either struggle to find the courage to attack the European colonial powers, or, if they still do, the British have a very good shot at simply winning this war long term. The main question then is whether Germany's political crisis ever lets up. The answer is probably, but it is not guaranteed. It really depends on how much and how fast the economic situation rebounds without strong and concrete government intervention. In the short term, the electorate is unlikely to be charmed by presidents and cabinets limping into mild economic recovery without any action. But long term, the effects of the Great Depression will lessen eventually. New coalitions will become possible eventually. Perhaps the final hurdle for German democracy will be the 1939 election, in which a centrist will again face some anti-democratic candidate. Should the democratic forces win again, we can generally assume that Germany will be on the long road to recovery as a respected democratic nation with a powerful industrial base. And there seems little doubt that this would be to the benefit of Europe and the world at large. But even if the anti-democratic forces take power in 1939, there is a big difference between an ultranationalist Germany in 1933, starting a swift economic recovery program and outcompeting their European competitors, and an ultranationalist Germany that only starts consolidating power 7 years later. By 1940, the geopolitical balance of Europe will be radically altered. Especially Britain will have far better recovered from the Great Depression, being far more capable of matching the German military buildup, and potentially being more assertive on the European scene. Japan may have already begun their war, and so the conflicts in Asia and Europe may not even happen simultaneously. The French military and defenses will likewise be more powerful, and Soviet industry will have had a decade more to grow and catch up to the West, with the effects of the Soviet Great Purge being less close to the breakout of hostilities. Even if an ultranationalist regime does take charge in 1939, it would have a far worse shot at winning than they historically had in 1933. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.